Video War Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Thursday, another Dahlia Thursday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Thursdays, I talk to you guys about the Black Dahlia murder, one of the most horrific crimes in American history. And in this episode, I will be looking at George Hodel as not only a Black Dahlia suspect, but also a Zodiac Killer suspect, and the Most Evil book series which accuses him of both sets of crimes. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Black Dahlia murder or the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and I am your host, Box Ned. Now, many of you will know that on Mondays I talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, and on Thursdays about the Black Dahlia, and this is finally the time when these two are going to intersect, and we're going to look at the prime figure in the Zodiac Black Dahlia connection, and he will have his own standalone episode. But this is heavily going to be centered on an investigation that was conducted by the son of George Hodel, Steve Hodel, who has written a series of books called Black Dahlia Avenger, as well as ones called Most Evil. And Black Dahlia Avenger came out in 2003, and Most Evil came out in 2009. And some of you may have wondered, why does he have two different series of books that are talking about the same materials, two sets of books that are talking about the same suspect, in a series of homicides, his own father, George Hodel? And firstly, let's look at the cover of Most Evil. Most Evil, Avenger, Zodiac, and the Further Serial Murders of Dr. George Hill Hodel. This one came out in 2009. And it's my understanding that at first Steve Hodel released the book Black Dahlia Avenger in 2003, where he accused his father, George Hodel, of being the Black Dahlia murderer, murdering Elizabeth Short in 1947. And George Hodel was a real Black Dahlia suspect. He was put under police surveillance. He was a medical doctor who was in Southern California at the time. Elizabeth Short was murdered in Southern California, and her body was found on January 15th of 1947. She was surgically bisected, she was beaten, she had her face cut in what's called the famous Glasgow grin, and she had a rose tattoo that was cut from her body. George Hodel is perhaps the most widely discussed suspect in the Black Dahlia case. And then, in 2009, Steve Hodel released this book, Most Evil, which, as I understand, is meant to talk about the similarities between the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer. And Steve Hodel created a presentation that he put online, which maybe you can even watch here on YouTube to this day, where he was documenting these similarities. And I watched it in the past when I did my first Zodiac podcast on George Hodel years ago, and I was really quite surprised because it was the verbiage that he was using. He was saying things like, "My father, George Hodel, was the Black Dahlia Avenger. Now let's compare him to the Zodiac Killer." And I was just thinking, well, now wait a second. If you think that your father was the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer, and you think these two killers were the same person, wouldn't you just say that, well, I think George Hodel was both the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer? So I really began to question his motivation for sharing the information that way. And Steve Hodel actually responded to my YouTube channel. He just showed up in the comment section to provide some clarity. And that is that when he released this book, Most Evil, in 2009, he really did just want to document the similarities between the two killers. And then in 2014, the book Most Evil Part 2 came out, where he decided that there was enough evidence to directly accuse George Hodel of being the Zodiac Killer. And Most Evil Part 2 is more or less regarded as the Zodiac Black Dahlia book in the George Hodel saga. And out of fairness to Steve Hodel, he does say that these series are interlocking, they're intertwined, and he recommends reading his books in the order of Black Dahlia Avenger 1, Most Evil 1, Black Dahlia Avenger 2, Most Evil 2, and so on. He has also released Black Dahlia Avenger 3 and 4, and a series of books called The Early Years, which is done in at least 2 volumes. And Steve Hodel also makes the case that his father committed numerous other homicides across the 20th century, and he may have one of the largest reigns of terror or proposed years of activity for the Zodiac Killer out of anybody who has accused a suspect and brought them forward, claiming in his book The Early Years that the first Zodiac murder occurred in 1921 with the murder of Father Patrick Heslin, and this definitely is well before many of the Zodiac Killer suspects were even born. Now that is the introduction. Now we come to this material. So for this episode, what I really wanted to do was, I wanted to go through his book, Most Evil Part 2, that accuses his father, George Hodel, of being the Zodiac Killer. And I'm going to look at this resource that has been posted online that just says, this is from Most Evil Part 2, by the way, and it says, it will begin with a follow-up investigation and reintroduce a list of MOs and crime signatures used by Dr. George Hill Hodel in the 40s, and compare them to the so-called Zodiac, who began his urban reign of terror some 20 years later, in the late 1960s. And really we're dealing with about 21 years, because the Black Dahlia occurred in 1947, and the first Zodiac crimes were on December 20th of 1968, with the Lake Herman Road murders. While a few of the 30 modi operandi and crime signature patterns could be considered generic if isolated, in combination they become extremely rare. In my 24 years with the Los Angeles Police Department, I investigated more than 300 separate homicides. None of those murders included the signatory acts that are exceptionally rare, and the mocking and taunting notes that were mailed in, and sending personal threats to the victims' parents, and mailed directly to their homes. Well, I completely admit that the Zodiac crimes were very odd. I completely admit that it's abnormal for killers to write letters and mail them in, or they're going to write these bragging letters and sending them to people, saying stuff to the media, sending stuff to victims' parents, as we're going to see, especially with the murder of Sherry Jo Bates. So what I'm seeing here is that the Zodiac really is quite different. Because if you look at other true crime sources, like I used to talk to you guys a lot about the book Homicide, The View from Inside the Yellow Tape by Cloyd Steiger. It's the memoir of a former homicide detective. And a lot of homicides that are investigated are like, well, a neighbor had a dispute with another neighbor, and one of them, started a fight. A neighbor was murdered, and this person tried to hide the evidence in a very sloppy manner, and they were caught within 24 hours. That's what investigating a lot of these homicides are like, not with someone who is choosing victims in very secluded areas like the Zodiac did, and then taking credit for it via phone calls and letters and writing a message on a car door. I completely admit that it is odd. Steve Hodel continues here by saying, in fact, I'm able to find a single modern-day serial killer. I am unable to find a single modern-day serial killer prior to the Zodiac's 1966 Riverside killing of Sherry Jo Bates, who used the specific MO of taunting the police and press with letters containing obvious misspellings, with only one exception. Dr. George Hodel in the 40s calling himself the Black Dahlia Avenger. Prior to those crimes, we have to go back another 60 years to 1888 and look at London's Jack the Ripper. Well, this is just absolutely not true if you mean that there were no serial killers that mailed in letters between Jack the Ripper and the Black Dahlia and then the Zodiac, that these are the only ones who did it. If you just mean that serial killers wrote in letters, well, we have the New Orleans Axeman that has a letter attributed to him, the 1918-1919 New Orleans Axeman. A lot of people believe that that's a hoax, but that's the one that says, I'm rather fond of jazz. If you have a jazz band playing, you won't get the axe. Okay, that's one. There's also the 3X killer of the 1930s that mailed in letters, and the 3X killer might not meet the definition of a serial killer. He murdered 2 people, but yes, the cryptic letters are mailed in. And then we even have letters that may be attributed to the Phantom Killer from Texarkana in 1946. And those are just 3 things off the top of my head to say that there are no serial killers that do this and, sending these things around since the Black Dahlia Avenger to the Zodiac. And before the Black Dahlia Avenger, there was only Jack the Ripper. Now, if you mean that this person is sending in letters specifically to the press with misspellings, I also think that we're probably going to find a lot more examples than what people are giving credit for. And just to say that they don't exist I mean, I don't believe that for a second. I think that this is something that is not super frequent. I will completely give Steve Hodel that. It's probably not a super frequent occurrence for somebody to commit a homicide and write in a letter with very, very bizarre misspellings, but I think it happened a lot more than people expected. But let's keep going with the book here. George Hodel was employed as a reporter for the LA Record and San Francisco Chronicle newspapers. In both the Black Dahlia Avenger and Zodiac crimes, law enforcement suspected that the killer might have had ties or prior employment with the newspapers. And even I suspect that because even I wonder about that, because the Zodiac seems to understand a lot about how the newspaper business functioned. He understood to send a letter to 3 different newspapers in 1969, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Examiner, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Equal printing, equal distribution, and so on. So, it seems like the Zodiac understood a few things, and also he knew how to get people's attention, he knew how to be provocative, and he was really trying to get his name into the paper, as evidenced by the Zodiac complaining later on that he didn't want to be buried on the back pages. So, Steve Hodel has created a list of similarities between the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer, and that's listed here in his book, Most Evil Part 2. The first is that both the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac were serial killers. And I'm just thinking, whoa, now wait a second. Hold on. You might think that the Black Dahlia Avenger was a serial killer, but has that ever been proven? Do we truly know that the Black Dahlia Avenger committed any crimes outside of the murder of Elizabeth Short? I do not know of one. It's possible. And I know it looks like a crime that could be committed by a serial killer, but I just don't believe that we have sufficient evidence to say that the Avenger committed any murders outside of the murder of Elizabeth Short. It's all just theory and speculation. Because this goes so far beyond the murder of Father Patrick Haslam in 1921. Steve Hodel will also accuse George Hodel of committing the lipstick murders in Chicago, the Chop Chop murder in the Philippines, and, well, the Zodiac crimes. But let's be clear, it has never been definitively proven that Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, was killed by a serial killer. Now this is the next one. Both the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac created their own marketing campaigns, public relations campaigns, along with inventing and providing a pseudonym to newspapers for them to use in headlining the crimes and the reign of terror. The names are the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac. Yes, absolutely. These names do come from the letters. This is factual, and we don't necessarily know who wrote the Black Dahlia Avenger letters, and some people even think that the whole Zodiac thing was a hoax. But these are names that come from letters. And then both the Zodiac and the Black Dahlia Avenger contacted and taunted the press by telephone after crimes. Well, contacting the press, I mean, did the Zodiac really call the media after he committed the crimes? He made calls to the 911 dispatchers, and we're going to see that there are going to be a few more accusations. But my favorite point on this list is actually the following one that says both of them contacted the press by telephone after crimes. Like the same sentence is written twice. Then we have contacted and taunted the police by telephone after crimes. This is what the Zodiac did. Absolutely. I mean, contacting the press, you really have to go with some unconfirmed information. Maybe you'd be saying something to the effect of, the Zodiac was talking on the Jim Dunbar show, but that was most likely a hoaxer. That most likely was not the Zodiac Killer. And do we have evidence of that? Yes. The Zodiac adamantly denied that he was the person who called into the Jim Dunbar show. That wasn't me on the TV show was his exact verbiage. Now, contacting the police by telephone, yes, the Zodiac did this. And specifically, the dispatchers. He spoke to Nancy Slover and Officer Slade, and saying that he was responsible for committing shootings at Blue Rock Springs and Lake Berryessa. Now, here we have they both use the press as an instrument to terrorize the public and promising that there will be more. Ah, but wait a second. Do you see how everything is getting blended together with these Most Evil books? Do you see how everything is getting blended together with these types of theories about how these serial killer stories are all connected? That might be true in Steve Hodel's mind. That might be true in what he is arguing in his books. The interpretation of the evidence that he is proposing But this line, "There will be more," that is from the Bates Had to Die letters. In 1967, after the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, we had the 3 letters that were mailed that said, "Bates had to die, there will be more," and one was sent to her father, Joseph Bates, that said she had to die, there will be more. Now, I might be in the minority, or I might be in the majority, I'm not really sure, but I believe that they were hoaxes. In 2016, someone claimed that he hoaxed the letters back in 1966, 50 years after it happened, and I believe that story, but I've received a lot of pushback for that. But to say that both killers said that there will be more, I mean, unless you're talking about some line in a Zodiac letter that I don't recall off the top of my head, the Bates letters are unconfirmed. The Bates murder is unconfirmed Zodiac activity. It has never been definitively proven that any of those things were the Zodiac Killer, the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, or writing any of the communications after her murder that was the Zodiac. So all of this stuff is just blended in together, and he's just putting it all out there like, oh yeah, all of that stuff was the Zodiac, and all of this stuff was the Black Dahlia Avenger, and all of these things were done by the same person. His father, George Hodel. The next line is, both of them drew a crude picture of a knife dripping with blood and mailed them in to the press. Okay, I mean, the Zodiac definitely did that. I'll take his word for it on a Black Dahlia Avenger letter, but remember, the letters are unconfirmed in the Black Dahlia case. Now, both of them told victims and the press that he was going to Mexico. Well, you know who also said that he was going to Mexico? D.B. Cooper. I mean, we're talking about geographic positioning. With D.B. Cooper, it's actually even more interesting, because D.B. Cooper said this in Seattle, in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington airspace. He said he wanted to fly to Mexico. Mexico was where people went when they were trying to avoid the law. I don't really think there's anything significant about it. The next point is, both of them used a knife and guns in separate crimes. Whoa, now wait a second. Did the Black Dahlia Avenger use a gun in any of the activities around the murder of Elizabeth Short? I mean, she was surgically bisected. As I told you, she was mutilated and beaten. What type of gun would be involved in that? I mean, that's all theoretical. Now, both of them included puns and word games in the mailings. Well, I mean, again, it's never been proven that the Black Dahlia Avenger wrote the letters, and they continued to send in mailings to the press for months and years after the original crimes. Well, I'm not convinced the Black Dahlia Avenger did that. Did the Zodiac do that? Almost certainly yes. And it really is quite odd, because there's this very small reign of terror that we have with the Zodiac from 68 to 69, but the letters go all the way to 1974, maybe beyond that. But ultimately, I don't really think there's anything that is truly shocking about the Zodiac's actions to do that. It's not shocking. It might be a little bit strange, but he already had people's attention. He's like, I'm a killer that's on the loose and you're not going to catch me. With the Black Dahlia Avenger, all of that is unconfirmed. There are letters that were mailed after the Black Dahlia murder, but we don't necessarily know that they were from the killer. Now, here's one. Identified himself as an Avenger, claiming that he was wronged by the female victim, or that he was getting revenge for being spurned and ignored by the victim. Once again, where's this from? Where's the Zodiac letter that says that he was ignored and spurned by the victim and that's why he committed the murder? I would propose that what Steve Hodel is talking about here with this is the 1966 Riverside Confession. Again, the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, when the person who sent in the Riverside Confession said that he wanted to punish her for all of the brush-offs that she had given him in the past. And Miss Bates went to the slaughter like a lamb. He's saying very specifically that he murdered Sherry Jo Bates because she had ignored him or not paid attention to him in the past. That is not confirmed Zodiac activity. And do you see, like, what I'm saying? This stuff is all just thrown together, and he's acting like it's definitively certain that the Zodiac did this stuff. I don't think the Zodiac did that. I do believe, though, that the murderer of Sherry Jo Bates wrote the letter. I just think they're different people. Now, the next line is, inform the public that the crime was justified or divine retribution. Well, Did the Zodiac say divine retribution? Maybe not those exact words. He said that he had a spiritual reason for doing this. The Zodiac said very clearly that he was committing these crimes because he wanted to have slaves in the afterlife. He wanted to die and be reborn in paradise with his slaves. And then we have stabbed several victims with a long-bladed jungle bayonet-style knife. Oh, the Black Dahlia Avenger stabbed multiple victims? I'm not aware of this. Elizabeth Short was one person. One person. And yes, there are going to be other crimes that occurred in Los Angeles. There's also going to be the murder of Jean French that happened shortly after the Black Dahlia murder. And then we also have the lipstick murders in Chicago, the Chop Chop murder in the Philippines, which is the murder of Lucilla Liu in 1967. She's called the Chop Chop Lady. Okay, these things definitely exist. They definitely happened. But were they all the same person? Never been definitively proven. The next line here, this point, is that the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac both wrote taunting messages at the scene on the bedroom wall and on a nearby telephone post and the door panel of a victim's vehicle or the victim's body. Well, again, theoretical, but the Zodiac did do that. I'll give them... If he's talking about the similarities between the lipstick on the wall with the lipstick murders and the Zodiac, yes, the Zodiac wrote a message on the car door at Lake Berryessa. Now, we have manually ripped away a band from a man's wristwatch and left a band at a separate crime scene near a victim's body. This again is referring to the murder of Sherry Jo Bates when she pulled off the Timex wristwatch band of the alleged killer. So we have a lot of points here on the list, and they are, some things that are a little bit fair. Yes, the Zodiac did do these things. The Zodiac wanted the media attention. The Zodiac wanted to taunt the police. The Zodiac wanted to provoke people. The Zodiac did harass people. But I really don't like that he's using all of these examples from an unconfirmed Zodiac crime, the murder of Sherry Jo Bates. If anything, Steve Hodel is showing that there's a stronger case that the Zodiac and Sherry Jo Bates were murdered by the same person. I don't believe they are, but he is making a more compelling case about the similarities between the Zodiac and the Bates murderer than anything to do with the Black Dahlia Avenger. I mean, every single strong point I've told you about, I'm just like, well, other than this pseudonym was created by the letters, what really is the similarity between the Zodiac and the Black Dahlia Avenger? I'm not seeing it. Now, here's something, though, that is on the list. Forcibly kidnapped a female victim, strangled her to death, and dismembered the body with surgical skill and precision. Then pose the body parts in public at a specific location. Okay. Steve, I'll give you credit. The Black Dahlia Avenger did do that. Elizabeth Short was strangled, and she was cut apart, and she was left off of Norton Avenue in the Los Angeles area, Lamert Park. But what does that have to do with the Zodiac Killer? Like, seriously, what does that have to do with the Zodiac Killer? Did the Zodiac strangle his victims? I don't think so. Did the Zodiac dismember the bodies of the victims? I don't think so. Did the Zodiac use surgical skill and precision? I don't think so. No, the Zodiac didn't do any of that stuff. Why is this on the list? That must have been something that was copied and pasted in by mistake. And I'm not even joking. I really think that was, that doesn't belong on this Zodiac Black Dahlia comparison list. And the next one is that a brutal assault and overkill, particularly savage with the female victims. I'll repeat that. Brutal assault and overkill, particularly savage with his female victims. I also disagree with this because there are so many simple explanations as to why the Zodiac Killer used more force on the victims, or more gunshots, more stab wounds on the female victims than on the male victims. If we go to December 20th of 1968 with the Lake Herman Road murders, then we have the attack on David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. David Faraday was shot once on the right side of the head behind his ear, and Betty Lou Jensen was shot 5 times. And I think purely that is because Betty Lou was running away from the Zodiac. So he gunned her down. He fired more than one shot because he wanted to make sure that she was dead. David had been shot first, so I think, and Betty Lou started running. Now it's completely unclear as to whether or not she was ordered to run and the Zodiac was confident that he could shoot her, or she did it on her own accord. If I had to make a determination now, I would think that she did it on her own accord. At Blue Rock Springs, The Zodiac more or less sprayed the victims with bullets. He didn't order them out of the car because maybe he was afraid one of them would try to run, and maybe he even had less control of the area at Blue Rock Springs. Mike Mageau and Darlene Ferrin were sitting in the car, and the Zodiac fired into the car. That's what I think happened, and I think that's the extent of it. At Lake Berryessa, the Zodiac stabbed Brian Hartnell first 6 times, and Cecilia Shepard 10 times. And I don't care what anybody says. That's not overkill. I mean, it's not overkill. Cecilia wasn't even dead. She didn't even pass away until 2 days later in the hospital. And with the Stein murder, a female isn't even present. So to say that the Zodiac Killer is doing all of this because he wants to have brutal assaults and overkill and be particularly savage with the female victims, absolutely not. And I think one of the only ways that you can justify the Zodiac Black Dahlia connection is if you're going to say something like, well, the Black Dahlia Avenger was much younger. The Black Dahlia murder occurred in 1947, and the Zodiac crimes were 68 and 69. 21 years, 22 years had gone by. So this really is somebody who was a lot older, tired, and less likely to have committed these crimes. And then I would actually like to move on to a different part of Most Evil Part 2, because this is something that I've only loosely talked about here on Black Box Online Radio, and this relates to the composite sketch that resembles George Hodel. There was a book that came out in 1974, sometimes 76, called The Great Crimes of San Francisco, and it does feature a Zodiac composite sketch that heavily resembles George Hodel. Steve Hodel has even made public appearances saying that this is the official police composite, and it looks exactly like George Hodel. But he explains everything in Chapter 2 of his book, Most Evil, when he says that this was created by an illustrator and artist named Neil Adams in 1974. He's the one who made the book cover and the picture on the book cover for the Great Crimes of San Francisco. And the exact quotation is that, "I am 100% certain that the book cover and sketch that I drew back then in 1974 was based on material that was directly related to the crime." Okay, so this is an artist's rendition of the Black Dahlia Avenger Zodiac Killer suspect. I mean, this is an artist's rendition of the Zodiac Killer. And he does look like the Black Dahlia suspect, George Hodel. But this is what somebody did when they wanted to create something that was their own take on the composite sketch. We even have the name of the artist right here one more time. His name is Neil Adams. So overall, what do you guys make of this Black Dahlia Zodiac Killer connection? I would love to know. Please put your ideas in the comments section down below. Some other background info about George Hodel is that he was born on October 10th of 1907, and he passed away on May 16th of 1999. And I might be going out on a limb here, but I think that George Hodel is the oldest Zodiac Killer suspect that is widely discussed. And let's be clear, he is widely discussed because of his son, Steve Hodel. He's widely discussed because Steve Hodel has put out these books, the Most Evil series, that talks about him as a Zodiac Killer suspect. Now, the Black Dahlia case, it is true. He was a real Black Dahlia suspect. But born in 1907, how do we explain a 61, 62-year-old Zodiac? And yes, he would have had his birthday on October 10th, one day before the murder of Paul Stein, so he would have turned 62 years old on the day that Paul Stein was murdered. How do we explain that? And this is something else that Steve Hodel has addressed, simply by saying that George Hodel looked a lot younger. He could easily pass for 20 years younger. He may have been 61 years old in 1969, but he could have passed for 41 years old. And you will also see this about people who are pushing older Zodiac Killer suspects. Mike Rodelli, author of In the Shadow of Mount Diablo, has a Zodiac Killer suspect named Shel Cavalli, who was 50 years old at the time, and he also says that Shel Cavalli looked a lot younger. When he was 90 years old, people thought he was 60. And it is possible for people to look younger. I'm just throwing that one out there. Now, some of you might wonder, how does George Hodel get mixed up into all of this? How does he become a Black Dahlia suspect? How does he become a Zodiac Killer suspect outside of these books? What's the origin of it all? And there are two major stories about this. One of them you've probably heard before if you've been anywhere near the true crime world, and that is that George Hodel was someone who was a medical doctor, Dr. George Hodel. He was trained in surgery, but his primary specialty was venereal diseases, and he became, more or less, the doctor to the Hollywood elites. He was in charge of the venereal disease unit in Hollywood, California, in that part of Los Angeles. And that meant that he was interacting with a lot of people who were very high profile, a lot of people who were in various elite circles, not only the actors and the actresses, but also the financial backers, people who were rich and powerful. And he became part of the circles of the rich and powerful. But that wasn't satisfactory for him because he wanted to do something that would propel him into the spotlight, even if it was under a pseudonym such as the Black Dahlia Avenger. So one person that he became friends with was a photographer named Man Ray, and Man Ray made a photo called The Minotaur of a woman that's all about using her body, posing her to make her look like the head of a minotaur. And yes, somebody wrote this out in the comments section here on Black Box Online Radio about how I say minotaur, but it's actually pronounced minotaur for that specific photo from Man Ray. And then we have this whole claim that George Hodel just wants to commit a surrealist art type of murder. So he murdered Elizabeth Short. Maybe they were dating, maybe they were introduced to each other, and one of them, one theory, I repeat theory, claim, one part of the story is that Man Ray was introduced, is the one who introduced Elizabeth Short to George Hodel, and they started dating. Okay, that's one variant of the story. But as many of you know, there is a channel out there run by Larry Harnish, who does monthly shows on the Black Dahlia Avenger, as well as on George Hodel. He does one monthly episode about the Black Dahlia, and one about George Hodel and Steve Hodel, about the Hodel family. And he told a different variant of the story on his most recent AMA, and that was that, as already stated, that Steve Hodel accuses his father of numerous homicides all around the world, and this also includes the lipstick murders that happened in Chicago. And the lipstick killer was identified as William Hirons, although it's quite possible that Hirons did not do it and he was wrongfully convicted. He may have actually committed a murder. I'm just going to share a story that I heard, and that is that William Hirons murdered a police officer, and they wanted to blame him. They wanted to convict him for something. And they had the opportunity to bust him for the lipstick murders and do this whole high-profile trial, and it just closed everything. That's a story that I heard. But I even recall from watching Steve Hodel in the past that he stated that William Hirons confessed to this under torture. He did confess to the lipstick murders, but he was tortured and even having his testicles injured, and it was a torture confession that was extracted. But I do remember listening to William Hirons' own words when he stated that he did confess to the crime and plead guilty, but that was to avoid the death penalty. He has maintained his innocence throughout the entirety of the time. He spent 65 years in prison before he passed away, and he just said that he didn't do it. It's just if he accepted the guilty plea, then he had a chance to prove his innocence in prison. If he didn't, then he was certainly going to get the death penalty, and if he were dead, he wouldn't be able to justify himself, or he wouldn't be able to clear his own name. Who do you believe, really, what's going on? But you have the lipstick murders in Chicago. And one theory is that Elizabeth Short went to Chicago. This is what Larry Harnish shared on his most recent AMA, and some people were saying this stuff about how she became an amateur investigator and an amateur reporter, and she's trying to extract information from people about who actually committed the lipstick murders, and specifically this would be following the trial, and it seems like she developed the notion that William Hirons was innocent, and she began interacting with people who provided more information to her, and she learned that the real name of the killer was George Hill Hodel, and she went to Southern California, and ultimately she was murdered, and the reason why George Hodel murdered her was because she had this information about the lipstick murders. Did that really happen? No. And I don't think Larry Harnish believes that happened either, and I don't think he's trying to put words in Steve Hodel's mouth. This is something that he has clearly heard from somebody else, and he's sharing it with his audience the same way that I'm sharing it with you guys. I don't think that happened because here's one part of the story that I intentionally left out, and that is that Elizabeth Short was working as this amateur investigator. I mean, firstly, I'm not even sure the details of that, what that would mean. Is she just a true crime sleuth, a hobbyist, or is she trying to make a name for herself as a reporter in Chicago? But then part of the story is that she would have started sleeping with men to get information out of them about the lipstick case. Again, did that really happen? And I have found that out of all the stories that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio, whether it's the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and the disappearance of Maura Murray, D.B. Cooper, that the Black Dahlia case is the one that gets the most mudslinging, the most victim shaming, and the most victim blaming. And so many times I've just dealt with these stories that are just ridiculous in a sexual nature about Elizabeth Short. And you will find them very early on, that she was working as a prostitute, but she had malformed genitalia, so she couldn't have penetrative intercourse, so she would work as a prostitute by giving oral favors to people, all of these things, and it doesn't seem like there's any credibility to it at all. It doesn't seem like there's any truth to that stuff at all, and it's just people who are saying ridiculous things about a victim to be scandalous, or trying to make the story more outrageous than it actually is. For goodness sake, the woman was cut in half and left on the ground in the Los Angeles area. Is that not ridiculous enough? Is that not outrageous enough? Does that not just set off the alarm bells for you enough? Do you have to twist things around and turn this into some type of weird sex story? I don't get it. I don't get it. Now, if it were supported by facts, that would be one thing, but everything that I've just told you seems to be that there are these stories going around about her actions and activities. And to the credit of Larry Harnish, he has really tried to clarify and end a lot of these rumors that have been going around. So many rumors about Elizabeth Short, and they're done in a negative way. I mean, it really is just a lot of mudslinging. But ultimately, you heard some things from Steve Hodel's book there, Most Evil Part 2, which is the one where he accuses his father of being the Zodiac Killer. And as you can tell, I'm really not impressed with this presentation, because as I said, a lot of points on that list weren't even relevant to the Zodiac Killer. You're talking about the similarities between these two killers, you're talking about the similarities in MO. I'm like, I don't think the Zodiac had anything to do with some of those points. And you already heard that stuff about the murder of Sherry Jo Bates and so on, using the unconfirmed to prove the unconfirmed, as I call it. But I'll share an interesting thing with you, and that is that when I did my first book discussion here on Black Box Online Radio, I was talking about the Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986, and I was looking for a second Zodiac Killer book to discuss, and the two ones that I really wanted to read were The Zodiac Killer Cover-Up by Lyndon Lafferty and Most Evil Part 2 by Steve Hodel. Lyndon Lafferty was the person who first got me interested in the Zodiac case, sent me down the rabbit hole back in 2011, and with Steve Hodel and Most Evil Part 2, I simply just wanted to know more about this George Hodel theory. I simply wanted to explore this more and find out what does he actually think about the connections between the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer. And Most Evil Part 2 doesn't seem like it's going to be the worst Zodiac Killer book that's ever been written. No. The Zodiac Killer Cover-Up by Lyndon Lafferty is the worst Zodiac Killer book that has ever been written. And I have a 2-part book discussion about that here on Black Box Online Radio. One more time, I invite you to hit the like button and subscribe. But it really, that was just a very big disappointment for me. I mean, he's the guy who got me most curious about the case after, I had heard about the Zodiac on America's Most Wanted and the Fincher film came out. But really, it was Lyndon Lafferty appearing on a radio show that pulled me into this. I hated his book. I'll even say it. I hated it. Terrible. With Most Evil Part 2, I just think that it's an impractical book, and I will share all of that very, very openly. And out of all of the things that I've told you about here in this episode, I would really have to give George Hodel a 1 out of 10 suspect rating. 1. And remember, you get 1 point just for being alive. So, in a lot of ways, that makes him a 0. Number 1, I don't think the Zodiac was a medical doctor, or there is no evidence of that. I already told you that George Hodel was a medical doctor. Number 2, when we're dealing with a 60-year-old suspect, even if he could pass for 40, we have so much contradictory information, like Brian Hartnell estimating that the voice he heard was from someone 20 to 30 years old, Mike Mageau saying that the person may have been as young as 25 years old, age estimates for the official police composites, not this one made by an artist, but the official police composites also go as young as 25, so I just don't think we're dealing with a 60-year-old person. Maybe someone who was actually 40 years old, not 60 years old, who just looked a little bit younger. So that's my ultimate take on the subject. Furthermore, we have just this entire wild set of arrangements going from San Francisco to Chicago to Los Angeles to the Philippines and then back to San Francisco, as well as throwing around all of these connections between the Black Dahlia Avenger and the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, when I'm not even convinced that the Zodiac murdered Sherry Jo Bates. 1 out of 10 rating for George Hodel. If you want to share anything and you want to dispute anything with me, you can put your ideas on the comment section down below. You can tune in every Monday for a podcast about the Zodiac Killer called Zodiac Monday. On Tuesdays, I talk about the disappearance of Maura Murray, and on Wednesdays about Jack the Ripper. You're listening to Dahlia Thursday now here on Black Box Online Radio. And finally, we have the Cooper Friday segment talking all about D.B. Cooper every Friday. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. I also release shorts and reels Monday through Friday on my Facebook page, Black Box Online Radio, as well as on Instagram, blackboxned88. And this show is available for free downloads anywhere you get your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. The images that you see going by on the screen are available at True Crime Designs on Facebook. True Crime Designs, please follow. And that will be all for me now, and I'll see you tomorrow for an episode about D.B. Cooper. And for now, goodbye.